Clete Willems, partner at Akin Gump, and until recently a senior advisor on trade and economics at the White House. The Phase 1 deal that was reportedly agreed last week between the United States and China has been widely billed as a win for China because it seems to be agricultural purchases in exchange for a postponement on the tariffs. How do you think that will be received in the White House, the reportage of the deal?
Well, I actually think that it's a win for both China and the United States. And if you're looking at it from the U.S. perspective, you've got to be realistic about where we are right now. And we aren't going to get the grand bargain in the next couple days, weeks, or months. And so the question is, how can you bank progress on some important issues with respect to China and then try to build on that momentum to have a more comprehensive deal? And in this short-term incremental deal that we're talking about, there was a lot of key things for the United States. Obviously, agricultural sales was part of it, but you've got to go beyond the sales themselves and look at the fact that China committed to making systemic changes to their agricultural policies. China apparently has committed to different things with respect to food safety measures to make it easier for U.S. to sell their products in China, biotechnology, which is going to help U.S. soybean exports, and then there's other provisions on intellectual property, currency, and things like that. So I think the notion that it's just an agricultural sales deal sort of misses the point, and I think it's a win-win for the U.S. and China. They need to try to build some momentum, bank some progress where they can, and then hopefully find a way to deal with the issues more comprehensively.
You spoke about the deal, though, as if you've seen the details of it. How much do you know about how close it is to being agreed? Because we've heard from Secretary Mnuchin overnight here in Hong Kong that he was going to have calls next week in an effort to clinch a deal. Is this a done deal, or do you think that it still could not happen?
So I'm no longer in the White House, so obviously I'm not privy to the text that was discussed last week. But what I can tell you from my time in the White House was that this text was pretty evolved on a whole range of issues. And my understanding is that they're building on the progress that they had already made.
Okay.
And so there is a substantive text. Now, in terms of closing the deal, I think the President was clear on Friday and Secretary Mnuchin was clear over the weekend that there was still some work to do and that they're going to try to figure out the remaining details between now and November 16th or 17th when they meet down at APEC.
This is, this being a Phase 1 of potentially what has been billed as a three-phase deal. Is that a change in tack from the White House to what we'd seen earlier? Because President Trump had previously said he only wanted a big deal, he didn't want a partial deal. How does this phasing of a deal compare to what you were negotiating whenever you were involved with the White House?
So it is a little bit of a change in tack, but I actually think it's the right move. And I have been very supportive of the President going in this direction because, like I said, I think that the political conditions, unfortunately, are not conducive to the big deal right now. Nationalist sentiment has been on the rise in China to a certain extent. That's also happening in the United States. And so it's important for the two sides to figure out where can they make progress in the short term and then try to build off of that. And so, yes, it's a change in tack, but I think it makes sense. And I do think that it would have been a shame if all the work that we had done in the weeks and months leading up to this had totally gone to waste. So I think what they're doing here, bank some progress and then try to build off of that for the future.
Cast your mind back to May. I believe it was May when the talks dramatically collapsed and there was reports that China had sent back a heavily redacted version of the text. What, in your knowledge, happened then? And is this the same body of text that we're dealing with in the current negotiations that was redacted in May?
So my understanding is that some of the basis of the text from April and from May would serve as some of the basis for the text that the two sides will hopefully agree to at APEC. And the issues are very similar, and they're not going to just scrap that text and start from the beginning. But what happened in May, of course, was that the U.S. and China had been negotiating, they had been making progress. The U.S. had understood that China would be able to accept certain provisions, including provisions that would require changes to China's domestic law. And when China's negotiating team went back to Beijing and presented that to President Xi, they were no longer given that guidance. And they came back, as you mentioned, with a heavily redacted text, and I think the President was very frustrated because he did feel that we were closer to the deal than what China came back with, and that is what led to the escalation in tensions.
And isn't that sort of instructive? I mean, you've got the president on one hand who has been through that experience, but now he's trumpeting a deal which has not been signed. And we've heard from the Chinese side over the months that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Is there a danger that people are jumping the gun at the moment with this phase one deal?
Well, look, I think both sides were clear that there was an agreement in principle. There wasn't a fully signed deal. And so there was, in some sense, a meeting of the minds about what needed to happen for them to reach an agreement in November. So I think people should see that as positive. But I also take a step back. Let's put this in context and remember where we were at the beginning of last week. At the beginning of last week, there was the controversy over the NBA. There was the announcement of new sanctions with respect to what was going on with the Uyghur situation in Western China. And there was even a report that you're very familiar with that the negotiators might go home. And so the fact that they actually were able to come out of this and say, number one, we made a ton of progress on these issues. Number two, we hope to sign a deal, a phase one deal in November. And number three, we're going to delay the tariffs that were set to go into effect on October 15th. That to me is unambiguous, very positive sentiment. And I think, you shouldn't read into the fact that we haven't figured out every detail yet. That's how these negotiations work. Contextually, it was a very positive step forward.
Sure. And you mentioned some of the externalities, let's say the Uyghur situation, the NBA, perhaps even Hong Kong. As a trade negotiator and somebody who's spent a lot of time in the government, how much bearing do those have on trade negotiations?
So they have less bearing in the room themselves than I think most people think. And last week, despite all the things that were going on, all the noise that was out there, my understanding is the negotiators sat down and they worked through the text that they had been working through for the months leading into that meeting. That said, I do think that atmospheric is very important to the way that deals are perceived from the outside and to the flexibility that a negotiator might have overall. And so when things are perceived as going well between them, I think in the room there's a better vibe and a better atmosphere for negotiations, but those issues themselves are very rarely discussed at the table.
Sure. What's next? So we haven't heard anything about the December tariffs apart from perhaps a comment overnight from Secretary Mnuchin. Do you expect that they will be rolled back as part of the next phase of a deal, or is that conditional on agreeing this phase one of a deal?
Right. Well, look, Secretary Mnuchin obviously is in the room right now, so he's closer to that, and I think we should take what he said at face value. My understanding of it is basically that the U.S. is going to wait and see, and if they can effectuate this deal at APEC and then continue to progress along, my understanding is that those tariffs do have a good chance of being rolled back. And again, I think it's in the U.S. and China's interest to do that. Further escalation here is not good for either of our economies. The U.S. definitely needs to have leverage over China to get China to change these long-standing unfair trade practices, but it's better that they make progress at the negotiating table than be escalating with tariffs.
And what about the structural stuff? When does that come in? And there's a sense, and it's often said that President Trump is interested in a transactional deal. He wants to have something that will, send the markets soaring. Do you get the sense that he is also keen to pursue these more structural issues in the Chinese economy, and when do you expect those to follow?
Well, I think phase one will include some structural components, and I already alluded to you some of the components in the agricultural sector. So sales is one thing, but when you're talking about China improving its food safety measures so that the U.S. can sell more product over there, when you talk about biotechnology, those are structural issues within agriculture. And so this first phase of the deal is structural in addition to being more commodity purchase oriented. And then once you go beyond agriculture and you're looking at intellectual property, when you're looking at those other issues, those are structural as well. So my understanding is that this first phase will have structural components that will buttress some of the commodity purchases, and then I think subsequent phases will also include some mix of purchases and structural elements.
Great. Thank you so much, Clete, for joining us.
My pleasure.